Welcome all, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Annie Aguiar, and I'm the audience engagement producer at Poynter. And thank you so much for being here today. It's been a big week for journalism with yesterday's Pulitzer Prizes, and we here at the Poynter Institute have been covering all angles of the prizes, from the size of the newsrooms to individual winners, and we'll get all a bit more into that today in this discussion. We're here for breaking down the 2024 Pulitzer Prizes, a LinkedIn Live discussion from Poynter's newsroom, where we'll talk a bit about this year's winning entries in journalism's biggest contest. Speakers, could you unmute and introduce yourselves?
Hey everybody, I'm Tom Jones. I'm the senior media writer at Poynter, and I write the daily Poynter Report newsletter.
Hey, I'm Ren LaForme. I'm Poynter's managing editor, and this was my 5th year leading our coverage of the Pulitzer Prizes.
Hi everyone, I'm Amaris Castillo. I'm a reporter for the NPR Public Editor's Office and a contributor to Poynter.
Yeah, I'm Rick Edmonds. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm Rick Edmonds. I'm the media business analyst and joined the Pulitzer team on this one day a year.
Hi, I'm Angela Fu, and I'm the media business reporter for Poynter.
Hi, I'm Alex Mahadavan. I run Poynter's media literacy initiative, MediaWise, and contribute to Poynter.org.
I'm Jennifer Orsi. I'm a Senior Director for Publishing and Local News Initiatives at Poynter.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for being here. Just want to get us started right away. Everyone, what are some overall impressions of the big winners from yesterday's Pulitzer Prizes?
Well, Tom Jones here, and I can tell you that, usually when the Pulitzer Prizes come out, the first thing I go to is public service. Now, look, I know all the Pulitzers are a big deal, but public service to me is sort of the biggest, most prestigious award of all. And it's interesting, like during the course of the year when I'm putting together the Poynter Report every day, I try to read as much as I can. And every now and then you come across a story or a series of stories where you start to think like, wow, that's really good. That could be you start thinking ahead, like that might be a Pulitzer Prize finalist when the time comes. And that's exactly what I thought when I saw the ProPublica stories by a series of writers. And they put out this series talking about the Supreme Court and how this small group of politically influential billionaires basically wooed the justices with gifts and travel. And as soon as you read this story, two things stood out to me. One, I can't believe this is going on. But number two, it wasn't as if this story was ungettable. Like anybody could have got at this story. And that's what I really like about Pulitzer Prize type stories when anybody could have gone after it if they just put the time and effort into it. They did their homework. They did a lot of interviews. This stuff was on the record. And I really appreciated it. And at the end of the day, when I saw that it had won the Pulitzer Prize, I was both happy for ProPublica, but I also thought like, yeah, that's how it's done. And I'm not surprised at all. So that's what stood out for me.
Yeah, I think we saw a lot of the things that we thought might actually win, which is good because, we work at a place where we're constantly reading news and I think we're pretty good at looking and finding the best of the best. And, I got to say, though, I really look forward to the Pulitzers every year because it's like the Oscars where it's an opportunity to reflect on the best of the work of the year and catch up on what I missed. And besides the great winners this year, I've had a really fun time watching how often people have been bringing up Kendrick Lamar's Pulitzer win from a few years ago, now that he's in this feud with Drake. It's kind of silly, but it's a barometer that, the Pulitzers are something that everybody is familiar with, journalists or not.
I mean, if Kendrick wants a position on the board, that is something to take up. Before we move on, anyone else who just want to check for some overall impressions of the big winners from yesterday? All right, on we go. So out of the themes from this year's awards, Israel's war in Gaza stood out as front of mind in who the judges selected. Pulitzer wins can reflect a year in crisis. Tom, you wrote a bit about this year's Gaza focus being a sign of the times, as you said. How are this year's Pulitzers different from a typical year?
Well, in a lot of ways, they're not different than a typical year. And I think one of the interesting things about the Pulitzer Prize is you go back through history and if you look at the winners of the Pulitzer Prize, particularly in the big categories like national news or international news, you will see that they basically reflect, it's a timeline of our history. It reflects what's going on in the world at the time. I mean, I just looked up the last few years when you think about it. Last year, the war in Ukraine dominated the Pulitzer Prize awards. Go back a year before that, there were a lot of things about January 6th were at the forefront. Go back a year before that, 2021, the Minneapolis Star-Tribune won for their amazing work covering the murder of George Floyd. And that was also the year that Ed Yong from The Atlantic wrote these amazing stories about COVID. So if you go back over time, even before that, you go back to 2019, some of the stories that were Pulitzer Prize finalists or winners had to do with like the Parkland shooting or the Tree of Life synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh, mass shootings. I mean, that's what I mean by the sign of our times. Like you look back through history, Watergate, to go back even further. I mean, these are the stories that I think get reflected in the journalism that we do, and amazing places like the Washington Post and New York Times and smaller regional newspapers as well. And again, you want to know about our history? Go look through the Pulitzer Prizes. That gives you a real good sense of what's going on in our world at the time.
To pivot a bit to the specific journalism that won focusing on Gaza, Angela, you wrote a bit about these winning entries for this year's prizes. Can you tell us a bit about what that reporting, what that work looked like?
Yeah. I know you asked Tom about like how were this year's Pulitzers different from typical years. I do want to start out by saying that like with Gaza, I think it is notable that the Pulitzer Board issued a special citation for journalists covering the war in Gaza. Special citations are pretty rare. Like last year, the board didn't issue one. But they decided that this year they would honor the journalists and media workers in Gaza covering the war, as well as those who have lost their lives doing that work. And because of Pulitzers, they also honor like the arts and letters. In their citation, they made note of writers and poets who have also lost their lives in Gaza. The Pulitzers exist 2 years ago and 3 years ago for journalists in Afghanistan and Ukraine, and so they decided to do it again in Gaza, which I think, or this year with Gaza, which I think is notable. As for reporting, coverage of Gaza made an appearance in 2 categories. So the New York Times staff, they won in international reporting for their coverage of the October 7th attack and Israel's response. You can see some of the stories that were part of that package on the Pulitzer website, but some of that work included multimedia elements like a video investigation into Israel's bombing of Gaza civilians. And the board also highlighted the Times reporting on Israeli intelligence failures. So, for example, the New York Times found that Israel knew about Hamas's attack plan for over a year and didn't act to prevent it. And then also Reuters won in breaking news photography for their documentation of the October 7th attack and the first few weeks of Israel's assault on Gaza. And again, those photos are on the Pulitzer website. You can see several were taken on the day of the attack. And then there are also photos from the aftermath, including devastation in Gaza following Israel's response.
Now, news of the Times win for international reporting sparked almost immediate criticism on social media. Can you tell us a bit about that response and the context?
Yeah, so the Times has faced a lot of criticism in recent months for its reporting on the war, and a lot of it centered around this investigation they did that they released on December 28th that purported to find a pattern of sexual violence against women during Hamas's attack on Israel. It's called Screams Without Words, and a lot of people, after the Pulitzers announced that the New York Times had won for international reporting, they brought up that people on social media brought up that investigation. And so the reason why there's been so much controversy is that several other outlets and journalists have taken issue with the reporting that went into that investigation. The Intercept in particular has done a lot of work on this. So if you want to know more about it, I'd recommend reading their pieces. But for example, they questioned the qualifications and motives of one of the key authors of that investigation. She's an Israeli filmmaker who doesn't have much journalism experience, and she's also liked posts on social media calling for the destruction of Gaza. So there have been questions about the reporting process behind that investigation, as well as the accuracy of the anecdotes within it. There have been some inconsistencies. And so the New York Times has stood by its work there, but there are other outlets, other journalists who are calling for an independent review. All that being said,
just to be clear, like Angela, that was not part of the submission, right? For the Pulitzer Prize?
That's right. Yeah. So all of that being said, the piece was not part of the submission that the New York Times gave to the Pulitzers for international reporting. You can see what pieces they did submit on the Pulitzer website. I think there are like 7 or 8 pieces. And so your New York Times, they've written like 1,000 pieces on the war, done like hundreds of videos, thousands of photos. And so of the work that they did submit, that investigation, the one that's caused so much controversy, was not part of it.
Thank you for that explanation, Angela. So to focus a bit more on the Breaking News Photography Award that you just mentioned, which went to Reuters photography staff for what the Pulitzer Board called, quote, raw and urgent photographs documenting October 7th, deadly attack in Israel by Hamas, and the first weeks of Israel's devastating assault on Gaza. Alex, your work with MediaWise touches a lot on misinformation and quality information. What is the value of on-the-ground trained photojournalists during an armed conflict in the digital age?
It's incredibly valuable. I mean, when news of the attack broke, I think myself and probably most people went to, unfortunately, social media to find out what was going on. I went to X, Twitter, which, is like one of my biggest flaws, but it was just inundated with misinformation. One of the first videos I saw was this fake video that came from a video game of like this fighter jet. We saw miscaptioned images coming from Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, basically like any other place in the world was being relabeled as, oh, this is what's happening in southern Israel. This is what's happening in Gaza. So for Reuters and the other news agencies that had photojournalists there or stringers there, they were basically able to jump in and fill this information vacuum, fulfill this demand that people had to see what was actually going on there. Because, any time a conflict is broken out, we saw this with Ukraine, you see people rushing to spread disinformation because they, make money off of that through, like partner payments from X or views on YouTube videos. And so you have this big incentive to spread misinformation about these conflicts. So it's incredibly valuable to have journalists there showing what's actually happening. And then, on top of that, you have officials from the conflict trying to say, this is what's happening. This is our view of what is happening. These journalists can be there documenting on the ground the images of the death and destruction that, maybe some people are saying, oh, this isn't happening, or this is what's happening. Like the journalists are the ones there who can actually show what's happening on the ground. And it counters misinformation and it counters propaganda.
Now, Ren, with some of this Reuters photography coverage that won the prize, these photojournalists were accused by Israeli officials of collaborating with Hamas and embedding to be there for that initial assault. What does this dynamic say about the scrutiny under which news organizations in conflict zones operate?
Yeah, let me talk more generally, and then I'll talk more specifically. Access for journalists during wartime is almost always fraught. The reporters often embed with military personnel and see only what they're shown and what those militaries don't want them to see. Or they head into war zones independently, sometimes with the help of fixers, and they often work at great risk to their personal safety. The conflict underpinning what's happening in Gaza is millennia deep, which brings its own level of scrutiny. And though it's a cliche, the fog of war is a real thing. So here's what we know about this specific instance. Reuters photographers were there to make images during the October 7th attacks. Reuters said it did not have any advanced knowledge of those attacks. But here's another thing we know, right? The winners have risked their lives for images that we have only seen through Reuters. Some of those photographers have lost their homes, some have lost their friends, some have lost their relatives, and at least one Reuters visuals journalist has been killed by an Israeli tank on the border with Lebanon. And that is valuable work, and that is work that deserves recognition.
Definitely. So looking a bit more generally at the list of winners, there were a lot of big recognizable names in the list of, people who had submitted and won journalism entries, but there were plenty of smaller ones that you might not be familiar with, including 2 wins for the Invisible Institute. Angela, you wrote about the Invisible Institute's work and mission. What can you tell us about the Institute, its wins, its work, etc.?
Yeah, so the Institute is a nonprofit newsroom in Chicago. They won 2 Pulitzers this year. One was for local reporting for a series they did in collaboration with City Bureau, another nonprofit newsroom in the city. And they worked on a series about how Chicago police have neglected and mishandled missing persons cases involving Black girls and women. And the other Pulitzer they won was in audio reporting for a podcast they co-produced with USG Audio that revisited a 1997 Chicago hate crime and its connections with the host of that podcast. They describe it as like part investigation, part memoir. And so what's remarkable about this is that this is a small newsroom, like roughly a dozen people, and they won 2 Pulitzers this year. And this follows their showing in 2021 when they also won a Pulitzer in national reporting. That year they were named a finalist in audio reporting as well. So they've won 3 Pulitzers in 4 years, relatively small, relatively young as well. They started in 2015. And so most of their work focuses on criminal justice and policing, and their executive director, Andrew Fan, told me that what sets them apart from other newsrooms is their relationships that they've built with organizations and people in the community. As you might have noticed, they work with other newsrooms to produce their investigations, and in addition to working with journalists, they also have civil rights lawyers, data scientists, other people in the community that they work with. And you can see that in their work that won the local reporting award, for example. A lot of that project came out of a different project that was developed by their data director that focused on, they use machine learning techniques to analyze police records. And so it's pretty remarkable that this small newsroom has seen so much success and produced so much good reporting with relatively limited resources compared to some of the bigger organizations like New York Times or the AP.
No, it's extremely notable, especially considering what you noted in your article with, 4 Pulitzer nods in something like 3 years or something along those lines. It really is just fantastic to see, So Rick, it seems that kind of going along these lines of the types of media outlets that won in this year, beyond who they are and what they stand for, there's a clear dynamic in the winners, having a big mission or having big resources. Could you talk a bit about the types of newsrooms who won this year and how we kind of saw that theme manifest?
Sure. Well, on the big resources side, and I think this has been said already, I think we all expected to see the New York Times and the Washington Post represented, and the biggest wire services represented, and for a good deal of that work to include the war in Gaza. I was struck as we were going through the winners and the finalists. Many small organizations, from the nonprofit startup sector, probably not familiar to too many people. Mississippi Today, Honolulu Civil Beat, the Alabama Reflector. Look out Santa Cruz that we'll be hearing from in a minute. And that's really a sign of the vitality of that group. And some of those are quite focused on a particular reform mission. Marshall Project, among bigger organizations, has been all over criminal justice issues, and they work, as does ProPublica, with local collaborators. What wasn't there too much also really hit me, which is I've been following these for many years and used to see metropolitan newspapers winning 5 prizes and honored as finalists in another 15 or something like that. That was literally the case 10 years ago. This year, no winners, 6 finalists, and it may just have been kind of off year, but I can't help but think, covering the business of news, that the shrinking of this sector and lighter staffing, fewer resources contributed to that not particularly impressive showing.
And Damaris, you wrote about some of these smaller newsrooms with big wins from yesterday's Pulitzers. What did you find as you were writing?
Yeah, so it was really interesting to see, several smaller newsrooms, as you say, take home the coveted prizes. And as I reached out to winners yesterday, I found that these outlets were able to provide a service to their community above all else. The staff of Lookout Santa Cruz, for example, won the Pulitzer Prize for breaking news reporting for their coverage of Santa Cruz County's catastrophic floods in January of last year. I spoke with CEO and founder Ken Doctor, and he said, and I quote, "It just speaks to how that team met the moment when they needed to in a moment of community crisis." And that staff, they're small, about 15 staffers, I believe. They took on the heavy responsibility of getting the most accurate information out there for their community members, many of whom were in need as the floods severely impacted roads and disrupted daily life. It was, survival mode in the community at the time. And as Angela mentioned earlier, the Invisible Institute won 2 Pulitzers, and their award-winning work was really about giving voice to marginalized communities of Chicago. Sarah Conway of City Bureau and Trina Reynolds Tyler of the Invisible Institute were the winners of the Pulitzer Prize for local reporting for their series on missing Black girls and women in Chicago. I spoke with them yesterday, and they gave a lot of kudos to the family members who trusted them with their stories. Reynolds Tyler told me that, she's from the south side of Chicago, and that a lot of people who she knows and loves don't really know what a Pulitzer is. And so she feels grateful for the opportunity for further impact to occur outside of the awards. What matters is what.
Annie, our gracious host, you wrote about this year's winner for illustrated reporting and commentary. Can you tell us about that win and the category?
Yes. So this year's winner for illustrated reporting and commentary was The Diary of a Rikers Island Library Worker from comics artist Midar de la Cruz, which was published in The New Yorker. De la Cruz, who also works as a library assistant for the Brooklyn Public Library, has worked in Rikers and another prison. He's illustrating glimpses of his life while working at Rikers in this piece. It's notable work in part because there is such limited access inside Rikers for journalists. Cameras and phones aren't allowed inside, which De la Cruz notes in his piece. So he draws these scenes that he remembered, creating images from inside Rikers that few photographers can really ever hope to capture, and humanizing these detained New Yorkers who just want to read these books from the library, which is a squeaky cart that has an ironic label as the mobile library. It's a really interesting piece, and it's not a traditional comic. There's no real plot writing in the background, very limited speech bubbles. And it kind of speaks to how interesting this category of illustrated reporting and commentary really is. This is only the 3rd winner ever in the category, which was created in 2022 to succeed the more traditional editorial cartooning category. And you can even look at the finalists for this year and see the amount of variety speaks to what a young kind of category this is. This year's finalists include traditional political cartoons from the Chattanooga Times Free Press, which Tom Jones praised in his Poynter report this morning. A parallax scroll illustrated story also in the New Yorker in kind of a similar vein to our next finalist from the Washington Post, an interactive comic with inset panels and illustrations to scroll through and experience. There's a wide range of work, and none of it really looks like each other, which is it's so exciting, especially as many people have been turning to AI tools to generate illustrations and other image assets as needed, taking away those opportunities from human artists and illustrators. It's nice to see this continued range of quality work coming from newsrooms that is so rooted in human illustration and art. On a personal note, as a hobbyist illustrator and comics artist, I always really look to this category to see just how newsrooms are really pushing the boundary here when it comes to visual storytelling. So really exciting year for illustrated reporting and commentary there. Tom, can I impromptu throw to you to talk a bit more about the editorial cartooning finalist who is in today's illustrated reporting, or yesterday's illustrated reporting finalists?
The illustrated reporting and commentary. One of my favorite guys is Clay Bennett, a guy that I used to work with years ago at the Tampa Bay Times, St. Petersburg Times. And if I'm not mistaken, he's been nominated, I want to say he was a finalist, I should say, 7 or 8 times. He's actually won a Pulitzer in the past. And it was he's an incredible cartoonist. Can I add one real quick thing about too, just on another on another category, just real quick. I want to talk about the criticism category, because when the finalists were announced, I was all excited that Zadie Smith, who's one of my favorite authors, she wrote the book White Teeth that came out back in the early 2000s. She wrote a review on the film Tar, which I read at the time and thought, this is terrific. And to see that she was a finalist, and then I was so disappointed that she didn't win. And I found out that it was Justin Chang from the LA Times. Then I went and read Justin Chang and his film criticism for the LA Times. I thought, oh, this guy's really good. So if you haven't had a chance, and this is what's the cool thing about the Pulitzers, it introduced you to some people that you might normally read. I don't read Justin Chang. And I went and I read some of his movie reviews, and they're just terrific. So it's another one of my favorite things about the Pulitzers.
No, definitely. As a, fellow film criticism dork, especially since Justin Chang won for his work at the Los Angeles Times, but has now since moved to the New Yorker, it's always exciting to see these bits of criticism that, I maybe did not spend too much attention to in a big discourse cycle, and just see it win these huge prizes. Speaking of wins, it's just fun to celebrate the wins. One winner, Hannah Dreyer, just recently celebrated something a bit more personal. She just had a baby. Amaris, you spoke to Hannah. Can you tell us a bit more about her win and this experience for her?
Yes, I did speak with Hannah this morning. She's an investigative reporter with the New York Times, and she won the 2024 Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting for her stories on migrant child labor across the U.S. And when I spoke with her earlier today, she was still admittedly pretty shocked and overwhelmed still by her win. In total, her reporting encompassed interviews with close to 500 migrant kids over the course of 2 years, and it includes several stories in the series. She told me that she hopes more people will look back on some of these stories on migrant child labor and pay more attention to to their plight. And she described the reporting for her series titled Alone and Exploited as the most intense reporting she's ever done in her life, partly because there was just so much uncertainty. For example, she'd hop on a plane to fly to a different state where there are migrant kids who work, and she never knew what she'd find or how the reporting would go. She didn't know if she would get there and she would fail. She describes it to me as always being on this tightrope. And her stories, after the first one was published, ushered in waves of impact, which included congressional hearings, a White House crackdown, reforms in multiple states, and more. And this is actually her second Pulitzer Prize. And yes, she is on maternity leave. She is a whole mother out here. She had her baby 7 weeks ago, and her baby even made a cameo yesterday when she visited the New York Times building to be with her colleagues in a special ceremony.
If you read Amaris's story talking to Hannah, there are some very cute photos of her and the baby celebrating the win. Before we pivot to a Q&A with our special guests here from Lookout Santa Cruz, I'd like to throw it to Neil Brown, who, in addition to being president of the Poynter Institute for Media Studies, is also co-chair of the Pulitzer Prize Board. Neil, you're in the interesting position of being in both of these roles at the same time. What can you tell us about this year's deliberations, what you saw as notable, really anything about this experience?
Sure. Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for joining this call. And it's been fun to listen to you all process with such perception and perceptiveness of what's going on, because we're living in this world of journalism, which is sometimes there's that sort of troubled narrative that we're all battling. But for the last few days, we're all pretty inspired, moved, both elated in the way the winners do, but also just sort of gratified that journalism is thriving, and the Pulitzers are one measure of that, and only one measure, because there's lots and lots of great work that's being done that doesn't necessarily win a Pulitzer Prize. A couple of observations about it, having the great privilege to be in the room where the deliberations take place, and while we're not allowed to talk about the specifics of the deliberations, I wouldn't mind just sort of validating a few points that have been made here. First of all, in a world where, again, journalism is very challenged, but there are new and interesting forms cropping up, being done in all kinds of storytelling forms. The number of entries to the Pulitzer Prizes was up by over 100 this year from the year before, and it's continued to go up. So folks are out there doing important work and seeking to make sure that folks are seeing it and have it recognized. You mentioned, among other things, Annie and others, the illustrated reporting category as being relatively new. More than 70 organizations were doing that kind of work. That's just sort of alternative ways of telling stories and attracting both younger journalists and younger audiences, as well as very powerful and traditional forms like Clay Bennett was able to do. So you got Rikers Island in that kind of form, and Clay Bennett, as you sort of noted. If you take the great conversation you've had about small organizations and nonprofits, we have the 2 awards that went to the Invisible Institute, and we're going to hear soon from Lookout, and some really powerful, interesting community organizations doing things to serve their communities. And I think Amaris and others mentioned the word service to communities. That is really runs through a lot of what we're seeing, both at the Pulitzer level and throughout the industry at Poynter. But what's more, we saw a terrific package from a very traditional outlet, the newspaper that covers the Villages community in Central Florida. And that was a project that was almost a throwback to a print approach, but done at a very, very high level that was competitive going forward. I love and was a big fan of the work of the Invisible Institute, including the podcast, the audio reporting category, as an example of folks who are covering something right out of their community, have sources in their community. And this is a story that's about a hate crime in Chicago in the late 90s. This was a story told in a relatively new form through a podcast, 7-part podcast, but also told in a way that showed and reflected very courageously the failure of the media itself over the years in buying into some pretty traditional narratives, in offering sources that had a pretty traditional perspective that did not ring true to the people who lived on the south side of Chicago and in the Bridgeport community where the hate crime happened. And this journalist who started with a community newspaper, had a sideline as a drug dealer and ultimately did prison time for it. And he confronts all of that in a way that maybe in a traditional time we would have said, well, is his credibility what it needs to be because of his issues? But he became a character in a story. And while we have traditionally been concerned about that, putting ourselves in stories, this is a new forum where that is acceptable. And again, he showed all his work to the audience who can make their own judgments. So it's a very, in many ways, for all the challenges we talk about, and they're real, the economic challenges, the challenges with misinformation, these are really difficult times. But there are folks finding a way journalists who believe in creative approaches, new forms, while embracing the fundamentals of accuracy and truth, even if it's in a different way. And it's just been a treat to be inside the deliberation rooms where we have one key rule at the Pulitzers, which is we do not grade on a curve. No matter whether you're a large organization or small, medium, whatever it may be, no matter what the story form is, it needs to have a caliber and a quality and an integrity to it that is worthy of a prize. We happen to be in a time where, fortunately, there are a lot of right answers to these questions, and you saw some of them in the awards yesterday. And then one last thing, and then I'll turn it back over to you, Annie. It is worth noting, in my opinion, that obviously we're in a very difficult time with the war in Gaza, with the wars in Ukraine, with journalists working under threat everywhere from Mexico to people who are trying to, frankly, do battle even at their local school boards or on a college campus. And we think it's really important, organizations large or small, from the great work we saw out of student journalists at Columbia and other places, or in very, very dangerous places like Gaza and the courageous work of the journalists in Gaza, but also of organizations like the New York Times, who are bringing us very difficult stories in a way that helps us not only understand things, but understand that there are no easy answers to some of these problems. And so yesterday we were very pleased to honor journalists of all kinds doing work under very, very difficult circumstances. And I think it displays and reflects just how much value our profession has. And it's been a treat to be part of it. Back to you, Annie.
Thank you so much for that inside perspective on the prizes there, Neil. So now I'd like to invite our friends from Lookout Santa Cruz to raise their hand and kind of join the call here to talk a bit more about their win. Lookout Santa Cruz yesterday won the 2024 Pulitzer Prize for breaking news reporting for its coverage of the catastrophic January 2023 floods in Santa Cruz County. Okay, you're in the call now. First of all, congratulations to you and your team. Could you unmute and introduce who's there on your end?
We are unmuted. It's good to be with you all. Ken Doctor here, founder, CEO, Lookout, and
Tamsin McMahon, managing editor of Lookout.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being able to join us to talk a bit more about the work. First of all, what was yesterday like?
Oh, it was a whirlwind. Yeah, it still feels like it's going on. It was amazing. I got a heads up on Sunday that we were going to be a winner. And I managed to hold it in until our Monday morning 10 a.m. news meeting, where I let the entire newsroom know. There was a huge shock. Most people didn't even know we'd entered. So it was overwhelming. It was emotional. I mean, people cried. It was an incredible experience. And the congratulations, bottles of champagne, the flowers, and pouring in. So it's been really gratifying.
I think Shock is a good word for it too. It's just, Tamsin's got more than 20 years. I have more than 40 in this. And I think, being in this trade, we know the importance of the Pulitzer. We have reporters that have been in the trade from 3 years to 30, maybe 30, 32 or so. And so it really varies. But everybody knows the word, but they, especially the younger ones, may not quite realize, how rare this is to be in that room, watching the video and waiting for the certification. Neil, you guys don't send out any kind of written notification. So, we're journalists. We're nervous that it might have been a dream or something like that.
I did hear that there were folks calling back to like at the Invisible Institute. Maybe you did the same. Your team, Ken, wait, we got this call. Are we sure we didn't just get punked?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But if we sent it in writing, it'd be, you guys would have leaked it in a heartbeat.
No, you were good. What you said, Neil, in your overview there, I think really hit the nail on the head. And you see it in Josh Benton's Neiman story this morning too. There has been real change in this news business. And you look at the kinds of both nominees and or finalists and winners, and how that is changing over time. And to me, this is about as much a part, and you hit it, it's about changing that conversation. This is not just a conversation about loss in local news. There is a lot of really good work going on, and a solid rebuilding. It's very, very spotty, but a solid rebuilding of local news. And I think in part we need to change that conversation, and I'm glad that we can be a part of this, and this definitely helps.
Well, I would say that the way you served your community with so many different forms as the story was happening, to some degree, a lot of us know that that's the way to go, but we thought that you all did it in sort of a steadiness and a consistency that kind of lived up to that. It's almost a little bit of cliche of meet them where they are, but that's what you did. You made yourselves available to where your audience was at a very difficult time.
Yeah, and Tamsin jumped on the story immediately, and you're right. I mean, both in the gathering of the information, of how you gather stuff, and then really importantly in how you distribute it, you have to be ready. We were talking about texting, and so texting gets through when the internet is down many times, and meeting people where they're at. You're right. It's out there in the language, but you got to explore every possible way to do it. And when you're in crisis, you can't figure it out on the spot. You have to be ready for it. So I think our readiness was really important, and just the people and the skills that we had ready to go to work those 12-hour days.
I was wondering if you could put us in the moment, like you just mentioned there with getting started. When the floods start, how did your newsroom spring into action?
Well, it was New Year's Eve day, so it was the worst possible time for a small newsroom because a lot of people were away for the holidays. And so I was at home, and, we knew the rain was coming. We had a sort of weather preview story, but I think we thought it was just a typical rainstorm, but it felt unprecedented. And then, the alerts started to come in from, the press releases from the counties, from local agencies about road closures and flooding and evacuation orders. And there was one fatality, and I just realized really quickly that this was not a typical rainstorm. So I think for the first day, it was myself, and it was our photographer, Kevin Painchode, he just has so much energy, and he ran around the community photographing video, interviews. We put that first story together. We alerted it by email. We got it out on social, and then I started to call the team in. And so people were coming back early from, holiday time. One of our reporters was in the car, making calls and trying to write. So we just all jumped in. So I would say within about 24 hours after that first, alert about the rainstorms, we had the staff kind of coming back. And then people really just, we had meetings to discuss where to go next, but so much, it was so quick. People just really organized themselves, and let me know where they were going, and they just fanned out across the county and fed everything into the newsroom. And it was nonstop, and we just put it out as quickly as we could, and you have to vet it. But, we just, everyone jumped in. Members of our business team jumped in to help us with social media. It wasn't all hands on deck effort for our team.
Even just looking at the timeline of work in the Pulitzer entry, you get such a sense of just how you all attacked the story. There's a great Google map with tying, reporter locations and individual story assignments. It's really wonderful. But there's a lot of this coverage. What are some of the highlights for people who weren't following this news at the time could look to understand the points of pride in this coverage?
Yeah, gosh, there's so much. We have our live blog. Obviously, I don't know if anyone wants to read that now, but that was our up-to-the-minute coverage. I highlighted a few different stories by different reporters about really, I think that captured the breadth of the coverage and the different issues. We talked about the response from local governments for the unhoused population. And there was some challenges there, and there was a scramble to open shelters and close them down again and reopen them. And, the way that the local governments were underprepared to deal with this. With the unsheltered population, we had coverage of South County, which is an agricultural community close to the Pajaro River levee. We raised some questions around the state of that levee, the infrastructure. It was supposed to be repaired. That was delayed. And that levee in March, it failed, and another rainstorm, and it flooded a large area of the South County and flooded, I think, 3,000 people out of their homes. We had stories about, people living in the mountains. We've heard in California about the challenges now of people having their insurance dropped. At the time, people were getting their insurance claims denied within days of having, a tree fall into their house or a mudslide, a landslide come down into their backyard. So we raised those concerns as well. I'm trying to think about, our politics reporter, Chris Neely, unearthed this plan to move a mobile home park that had been planned for years to move this, and just because of sort of political infighting and some changes in the sort of political landscape in California, it was never moved, and that was flooded. So I think, we definitely had the day-to-day coverage where we were letting people know, like, hey, this road is closed, this area is damaged, the practical information. But then I think we're able to step back and really look and say, what has been the response? What have been some of the failures and the shortcomings, and then also the ways the community came together to really help each other out. So I think the breadth of coverage to me, and our ability to go across the county and to really kind of delve into all of these issues and dig beyond the immediate breaking news was an important element of this as well.
So we talked a bit about this win in the context of the industry, what size newsrooms are, digital versus traditional print. But I just wanted to ask, what does this win mean for you and for your newsroom directly?
Want to answer that?
Sure. It's interesting. Tamsin made the point, and I'm trying to remember, it's been a flurry in the last 48 hours, that as proud as we are of the work that we do every day, and it's a really good cohesive group in office environment and a sense of forward movement and progress, we can forget that we're in this little town. And I really appreciate what Neil had to say about the caliber of the work that we are doing. Work that is as good as any in the profession in our little town. But it's a reminder of that, and I think it's going to be harder to forget that now with the award. More importantly to me, in two ways, that Lookout itself, we just announced about 10 days ago that we're moving into a second market in Eugene, Springfield, second largest metro area in Oregon. And we are starting to scope out sites 3 through 5. So this model is working very strongly, a community model, business model, journalism model, et cetera. And so it is clearly affirmation and validation of that. But much more widely, when I started working on this 5 years ago, and I had done my work as an analyst for 10 years and learned a lot about New York Times transition as well as covering the demise of local. And I want to see us change this conversation, that with the right amount of, with the right models, the right people, and enough capital, the repopulating of news sites across the United States can be done. It is hard. This is not easy. It's easier now than it was at the beginning. We launched into COVID. But it's really important that we use these examples to convince people of that. And it's good timing with Press Forward. Press Forward is looking for things that work. So what is working? We are happy to share what we've figured out, what we're still working on. But that is my hope out of this, is that it propels the whole repopulation forward, which is clearly what we need in such times of great national and community stress.
Hey, can I jump in on that, on Ken, what you said in a sort of call to action for all of us, which is to not only take the success that you've had with something as obviously dramatic and powerful as a Pulitzer, but to break it down as to why it was valuable in a, and I'm going to use the word marketing sense, to tell the story of not only what you did for your community, but how your community responded, and how I think the challenge going forward is, in addition to the support like from efforts like Press Forward, is that it's to do it because, quote unquote, it's the right thing to do, but that what your journalism showed and what we saw from a lot of these other organizations or continue to see is there's value in the marketplace. There's actual value there. And although we recognize that the business models are a little different, it's not just because you raised money, but it's because you raised money because people found value in what you do. So the marketplace is still fundamental to this, even if we have to diversify how it's all paid for. We're not doing all this just because we're good guys or because it's the quote unquote right thing to do. It's that the market will decide based on value. And you certainly offered that with the flood coverage.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, and it is also, I mean, it's interesting to add two quick things to that. One is we've got our 5 bottles of champagne and nice notes from some people in the proclamation. There is a point that's dawning on me today. It reminds me when I worked in newspapers, and you drive downtown and you see a newspaper building, and you'd say, that's our newspaper. Now, you might say that's our damn newspaper if you didn't like it, but it was your newspaper for your city, and you understood that. This is clearly after the time of multiple newspapers. There was a daily. It was a symbol of that city. And in the great loss that we've seen, and then offices are sold, buildings are closed, literally physically they have vanished. We actually are downtown. We have a sign on a building and all, and that's good. But what we're seeing today, 48 hours into this, is the community feels a pride in what we have accomplished. We are a representative, as the press should be, of that city, and we can do as deep investigative reporting and call out, do accountability as we should. People in leaders, but also elected leaders, civic leaders, they feel like they have participated in this. They feel a sense of forward momentum, and that is really valuable to our understanding of what's going on here. We have to offer communities the ability to support these kinds of things, and they have to be done at a really good level and caliber. But once they do, people come, and they come fairly quickly because we've just been publishing a little more than 1,000 days.
Tamsin, Ken, thank you so much for joining us today. Are there any final thoughts about the winning work or, what the Pulitzer means for your newsroom before we wrap up?
Oh gosh, I can't even put that into words. It's just incredible. It's incredible for everybody here. I mean, the staff is just so overwhelmed and emotional, and the fact that we have people who have been serving this community as journalists and through a challenging media landscape for decades to be able to receive this award and this recognition, and people born and raised here, who are only a couple years into the business also get that recognition. I think it's really been very meaningful. It's been incredibly meaningful that the work has been for all of the staff as well. This is a staff-wide award. It's not for an individual. It's for a collective effort. I think it's really that part especially, I think, has been a tremendous feeling for our staff. So, yeah, we're just elated.
Congratulations. Well deserved.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And with that, we finish today's conversation. Everyone, thank you so much for your time.